This is a strange passage, and it requires some explanation, because when you're reading this book of Habakkuk, it's very easy to sort of miss a major theme. And one of those major themes has to do with the issue of complaint. I realize that to some degree, some of what we think about God has been shaped by sources other than the Bible. And it's always dangerous when other ideas about God shape how we see God. It's why every Christian wants to be a very careful Bible reader, because we want the Bible to shape our ideas about God and not other sources. And the Bible becomes the book that explains God, because the Bible is the book from which God has revealed himself. I know that there is a popular song that says, "I won't complain." But whenever you read the Bible, you recognize that there is the gift of complaint, the gift of lament that is a part of the Bible world. When you look at chapter 1, listen to the way the psalmist, the prophet, records this. Habakkuk says in verse 1, this is the message that the prophet Habakkuk received in a vision. And in verse 2, he says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, and you don't listen?" He says, "Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery wherever I look?" And I don't know whether or not you're aware of this, but the writer is complaining. I believe that there is a place for lament and complaint in the context of the Bible in terms of how we deal with God. When you read the scriptures, you must recognize that there are places in which God literally invites questions. Verse 1 said that this was a vision given to Habakkuk. In other words, the speech of complaint was given to him by the Spirit of God. He didn't invent it. It was God giving him the opportunity to vent and to speak and to say without sanitized what was in his heart. And sometimes the problem in humanity is you work too hard not to tell God exactly what's in your heart. You can't develop intimacy with anybody being dishonest. And God has given the gift of complaint so that we can have an authentic relationship with him, not the fake one. Inside this passage, you have God, the Spirit of God, providing the questions, because what God wants is honest dialogue that allows you to deepen your relationship with God. I'll make sure I make this plain. You can't know God by always being fake. And it's completely unnecessary. You say, why? Because he already knows. And so he gives to us the gift of complaint, the gift of lament, so that it could draw us into a deeper relationship with him. Did you hear the questions he's raising? Why are you taking so long? Why aren't you dealing with this situation? When will it be resolved? And then God has the unmitigated gall to not give him the answers that he's seeking right away. And the writer says, the prophet says, that I'm going to wait. In fact, if you were to look at the questions raised inside chapter 1, God eventually throws them right back at him. And what you want to be clear about is that lament and questioning are God's gift to believers, because it allows us to be honest with God without the guilt. You don't have to be ashamed of saying to God and complaining and lamenting before God. He gives the gift of complaint. He gives the gift of lament so that you don't have to suffer from guilt from telling God exactly what's going on in your soul. And this writer comes because he is struggling and waiting for God in ways that are not unique to any one of us in this room. Now listen, this is the key. You see, there's two ways you can complain. You see, one person complains, and let me see if you can catch this phrase, if it'll make sense to you. There are some in the Bible who move from a posture of God. How could you allow such a thing to happen? That is different from how can God allow such a thing to happen. God, how can you allow, is more personal and suggests that we are engaged in the right way. How can God allow becomes a matter of unfaithful complaint. And there's a difference between faithful complaint and unfaithful complaint. And whenever you are listening to the scriptures and expressing the kind of complaint that is unique to who we are called to be because of the depth of our intimacy with God, there is always a place for faithful complaint, faithful lament before God. Especially while you're waiting for God to act on your behalf. Job is an example of faithful complaint. You see, Job is a guy who, in light of everything that he has lost, does not want to have a theological discussion with his friends. What he wants is a conversation with God. And when you read the story of Job, you would think that somehow this man, this praying man, in fact, if you listen to the way he talks and laments, you would somehow think that is indicative of not trusting God. That is not the case. His press of God, his desire to confront God, is not because he doesn't have faith, it is because he does. There's a difference between questioning God when you don't have any faith and questioning God because you do have faith. In fact, don't miss this, that at the end of Job's story in 42, what God does is he accepts Job's protests and rejects his friend's theological argument. Because everybody trying to explain God will sometimes never be satisfactory until you go toe to toe with God yourself. And God doesn't reject Job for that. He rejects his friends for trying to explain him when Job wanted a confrontation. Sometimes you got to cry out. Sometimes you've got to lament. And sometimes you've got to complain. And it's a part of the biblical framework to do it. And I know it's true in your life, and it's true in my life. Don't let anybody make you think they're always pristine and proper in their engagement with God. God is a person. And you engage God in the same way often that you engage other persons, which means you got questions. You desire answers. And I need you to be clear that God is never opposed to that. God is always welcoming and opening. Here, Habakkuk, you know what? When you read chapter 1, I don't think, and put it this way, what do you think would happen in the church service if somebody prayed that prayer? People would look at him strange. And yet, it's the way Habakkuk prayed in God's presence. But when you're waiting for God to do some things, you've got to recognize that there's a difference between being angry with God and enduring what's called anguish. Anguish is not the same as anger. And you can be anguished, wondering, Lord, how long? Wondering, God, when? It's in this text. In fact, what I like about his perplexity is that it's not anger. It is anguish located in a need for God to do something that appears as if God is not listening, God is not engaged. And when you walk as a Christian over any period of time, you must recognize that there will be seasons of dryness in which God seems to withdraw himself from you. And you have got to persevere through those moments, and you've got to lose the idea that his response to you is a part of his anger. No, sometimes God withdraws himself from you in order to draw you closer to him. I remember watching some young boys argue and fuss one time, and I realized that the tension was so hot until I wanted to speak to them, but in a room where there are 10 others, you can't really speak and they hear you until they settle down. And so what I did was stand in front of them quiet, not speaking. And what they eventually caught on to was, wait a minute, he's here. And as long as I stood there silent, I could hear the noise level start to drop. Because what they recognized was that my not speaking was simply silence waiting for them to be quiet so I could speak. And sometimes God sends turmoil at you. And you get so engaged in so many things that you want God to speak, and God is silent, not because he doesn't want to speak, he's waiting to. And he's waiting for your soul to settle down, waiting for the noise to get down so that you can hear his voice clearly. He's not angry, he's waiting for you. And sometimes the silence you experience from God is not anger, it is his patient waiting so he can speak to you in a way that you can hear. It's at that moment you begin to try to settle down so that you can hear him, because he is present even though you don't know it. This writer has come to the place where he realizes there's a tension that only God can resolve. He says in 2, then I'll climb to the watchtower, he says, and I'm going to stand at my guard post there while I wait to see what the Lord says and how he will answer my complaint. Because he's waiting for God to come through. It's strange because now where we are, we live in a culture where waiting is completely eclipsed. I told you about the little boy that he couldn't figure out why the microwave took so long. And I wanted to help him understand that before there was a microwave, most of your food was cooked on a stovetop and in the oven. And if you think a microwave is slow, you ain't seen nothing yet. You take your bacon and throw it in there and it's done in minutes. But guess what? There used to be something called a frying pan. In fact, I realize I'm speaking to another generation, but let me alert you to another reality that once upon a time, there was a thing on a phone called a busy signal. And what the busy signal meant was the other person was engaged in another conversation and you couldn't get through. And then they came up with something called call waiting. But there was a time when you couldn't get through unless you called the emergency operator and told her to interrupt the line. Y'all remember that? Now I realize with your smartphone or your dumb phone, whatever it is, that's hard to see, but there was a time when you actually had to wait because you couldn't get it as quickly as you wanted to get it. And in fact, I realize I'm dating myself, but there was a time when if you wanted to watch TV, every time you sat down, you had to actually get up and go turn to a channel. Now, I realize in the remote control age, you all think that that's like an antediluvian. No, but there was a time when you would sit down, and if you didn't like the channel you were looking at, you had to get up, walk across the room or wherever the TV was, and literally turn the knob. Come on, do you remember? Am I making? And so you have now been indoctrinated in a culture in which waiting for anything is completely eclipsed. Habakkuk realizes that waiting is a part of the necessary requirements in dealing with God. And he realizes, we should realize, that to be engaged in this area of complaint is not an indictment against the Christian, nor an indictment against God. God has given the gift of complaint, and the gift of complaint is designed to help us vent and engage in a level of intimacy through the process of lament that draws us closer to God while we wait. But while you wait, you have to realize that there's an engagement that's still required. The text here in chapter 2 says, then the Lord said to me, write my answer plainly on tablets so that a runner can carry the correct message to others. And all I want you to see is that there is a kind of waiting that is both active and passive. This is not passive waiting. He says, while you're waiting, there's something I want you to do. I want you to write. And sometimes when you're waiting on God, there is a requirement to actively wait on God by continuing to serve, continuing to live life, and continuing to do. You don't just fold your hands and say, I'm just going to wait. No, you continue engaging God in all of the ways that God has called us to. There is an active, participatory waiting for God to do whatever God is going to do as you keep on moving. You say, why is that? Because God only hits a moving target. There are some people who come to me and they say, well, guess what? I think I've been called to preach. And so my next question is, well, what do you do now? And sometimes they'll say, well, I don't do anything. So wait a minute, you don't teach Sunday school? Nope. You don't serve in the ministry? Nope. You mean you don't do anything at all, but you believe God is calling you from a standstill position of nothing to the more responsible ministry of the word. And what I'm saying to you is that God never operates like that. God hits a moving target. You've got to be engaged in something in which that giftedness is being expressed, manifested, so that others can see it and God can anoint it and then use it. But it doesn't hit you from a standstill position to something significantly responsible. Because God calls us, even in the waiting process, to be active and involved and engaged in doing something. And the thing about this text that is somewhat perplexing is that God has already spoken to the prophet in a way that's blown his mind. Because while he said, I'm going to wait, when God finally began to respond to him in chapter 1, God said to him, what I'm about to do is going to blow your mind. Inside chapter 1, verses 5, the Lord replied, look around the nations, look and be amazed, for I am doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe, even if someone told you about it. I'm raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and violent people. They will march against the world and conquer other lands. They are notorious for their cruelty and do whatever they like. Now, that's not the answer he was looking for. You see, he was wondering, I'm living in a violent culture now, and I'm waiting for you to respond, and I'm waiting for you to deliver me now. And God says, I tell you what I'm going to do, and what I'm going to do is so incredible that you wouldn't believe it even if someone told you. I'm going to use someone more wicked than y'all to deal with y'all. Y'all wicked, yep. And what's going on right now is the manifestation of your wickedness. But I'm going to use somebody else who is more wicked than you are to deal with you in your wickedness. And I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but every now and then God says something that just messes you up. It's not exactly the answer you were looking for. Now, to be clear, the point that I want you to extract from this is that God is God and he can use anybody he wants to use. I mean, in fact, that gives me great comfort. Maybe not because of this context, but what I'm glad about is that if he could use Babylonians, he could use anybody. And if God can use jacked up, cruel, messed up, wicked people, it means that I stand a chance. Because God is still God, and even in the waiting process, God will sometimes use people who are unlikely to work in your life for your ultimate good. No, they're not textbook portraits of who I would select. But when you're waiting on God, there is some comfort in recognizing that we serve a God who sometimes not only calls us to an unbelievable work, but a God who sometimes will use unlikely instruments in the process of bringing us to where he wants us to be. And I got to tell you, that's good news for somebody. Because every now and then, one of the things you sense in your own soul is a kind of unworthiness to be used by God. And don't let anybody deceive you. Everybody feels that from time to time. There is no Christian on the planet who ever feels that she or he is worthy to be used by God. Everybody is aware of their deficiencies. And let me tell you what the good news is for you and for me. It's that you have never been an asset. You have always been a liability. And God has used you in spite of, not because of, but in spite of your limits and your liabilities. That's why your desire ought to be to celebrate him, to serve him, and to say, God, I want to be what you want me to be because I love and appreciate how you've used my life. He says, I'll wait. And he's waiting for God to come through. And in his perplexity, he's engaged actively and he's engaged passively while God is working in his behalf. And hear how he concludes it. In chapter 3, the writer moves this way and he simply says, verse 17, even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, he said, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, able to tread upon the heights. Now, I want to tell you something right there. This is Habakkuk writing in anticipation of his need for God to do something and waiting for God to do it, but declaring, even though it has not been done yet. You see, this is economic deprivation. When you don't have grapes and figs, and you don't have cattle, this is not the 21st century. This is a world in which the fruit of the fields and the stalls of cattle, it meant something. And in the midst of their deficiency, Habakkuk says, no, I've made a decision that in spite of what is still missing, even while I wait, I'm going to rejoice while looking at empty stalls. I'm going to rejoice while looking at barren fields. I'm going to rejoice while looking at shriveled vines. Because what I've come to understand is that while I wait on him, God remains sovereign and God remains faithful. And I can trust him to do exactly what he promised he'll do. This is why. We've got to allow the Bible to shape how we see God and not just the sources outside of the scripture. Habakkuk was a musician. Habakkuk was a man whose background was inside the temple. And what he was accustomed to was worshiping God on the regular. And because he was accustomed to worshiping God on the regular, his worship of God had taught him how to wait on God. Because there's some things that come as a result of being engaged with God in a systematic way that allows you to know who he is and allows you to know what you can say to God and realize that God will accept you even as you are. Because in accepting you for who you are and as you are, his goal is to bring you in and to make you what he wants you to be. And Habakkuk understood this because he had been engaged with God on such a regular basis and in such a regular way that his perplexity still ends up in praise, because he realizes, I haven't gotten what I asked for today, but I'm going to wait and I'm going to trust in a sovereign God in spite of what it is I see. Why? Because I know he can do anything except fail. And that's when worship becomes electric, because you realize you're not waiting on some entity. You're waiting on a God who knows exactly where you are and exactly what you feel. And even though there's been a no and a door slammed in your face today, it doesn't mean it's going to be like that always. And even though you don't understand how God is going to bring you out of a particular situation now, you wait on God, realizing that the sovereign God can move in ways that bring you to a posture of stability, even if the stall is barren, even if the fig vine is dried up, even if the harvest is corrupted. You know there's a God who's the God of the harvest and the maker of heaven and earth, who can provide and produce and perfect and give you everything you need. And so you wait and you say, Father, I stretch my hands. There's no other help that I know. You don't look for a way out. You say, God, I'll study myself and I'll wait until you do what it is you promised you'll do. And I rejoice in the midst of it. Not twiddle my thumbs, I serve. Not complain, I'm active and engaged. And I wait and say, Lord, I'm trusting you to do what no man can do. I'm trusting you to do what I'm not able to do. And I'm going to wait until you make it a reality. And if you're going to serve God, you got to learn how to wait. You got to realize that it took 120 years before Noah could see some rain. And it took more than 40 years before Moses got back to Egypt. And it took several years before Joseph was released from the prison. But oh, if you just wait on God, you will see the salvation of the sovereign that will pick you up. Do I have a witness? You know how long it took you to get where you are now, but one day the Bible became like fire and the words jumped off the page and soldered themselves to your heart. And now you've got another way of seeing, another way of loving, another way of speaking, another way of living, because God did what he said he would do. Lord have mercy. Do I have a witness anywhere? If you wait on God, I promise you, he'll come through. Our old folks had it right. He may not come when you want him, but he's always just on, right on time. Is there anybody here that can say, Reverend, I know you're right. I've waited on the Lord, and they that wait on the Lord shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Again, I say, wait. Wait until your change comes. Wait until the situation gets better. Wait until it removes your enemies. Wait until you get stronger. Wait until you can see clearer. Just wait on the Lord. Because God will always come through. God will always come through. You can't faint and give up. Sometimes you just cry out and he'll accept that. He'll hear your cry. And sometimes the only way you can get whole is by learning how to just holler. But I'm glad there's a God who, when I cry out, he hears me. Anybody glad about that? That he hears me. And that if I just wait,